Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. It is a pleasure to see you on this Friday afternoon, June 30th, as we are still celebrating Pride Month. Pride Month is all year, okay? And we are the Clinical and Translational Science Collaborative of Cleveland, a collaborative among Case Western Reserve University and its affiliated hospital systems, the Cleveland Clinic, Metro Health, University Hospitals, and the Lewis Stokes Veterans Administration Medical Center. We aspire to be a catalyst for high-quality clinical and translational research, both locally and nationally, by changing the culture and environment of biomedical research, sharing resources and expertise, and streamlining the research process to move translational research from bench to bedside and to the community. Today, we have Kate Mozinski, they, them pronouns, she's an attorney in the Equality Ohio Legal Clinic. They are a Dallas native, but have made Ohio a second home. Kate attended the College of Wooster, where they earned a degree in international relations, and they are a graduate from Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Kate is an experienced litigation attorney and has frequently represented clients in discrimination cases, complex family law issues, and in numerous other case types. Kate is a passionate advocate for members of the LGBTQ+ community and is dedicated to working to extend access to justice to queer individuals across Ohio. Kate was recently named as one of the National LGBTQ+ Bar Association's 40 Best Attorneys Under 40. Congratulations, Kate. They are a proud member of the LGBTQ+ Bar and National Center for Lesbian Rights Family Law Institute. Kate is a frequent presenter to legal professionals both in Ohio and nationally. They focus primarily on teaching attorneys professional skills for culturally humble, ethical, and trauma-informed representation of LGBTQ+ clients. When they are not at work, Kate coaches high school policy debate and is devoted to helping make Ohio debate a supportive educational environment for LGBTQ+ students. They are also an avid organic gardener, environmentalist, and devoted cat parent. Kate is based in the Cleveland office. Welcome, Kate. We're so excited to have you. And the screen sharing capabilities are on, so can't wait to hear what you have to share with our research community.
Well, amazing. First off, hi, everybody. My name is Kate Mozinski. I'm a senior attorney over at Equality Ohio. I use they, them pronouns. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about just legal and lived equality for LGBTQ+ folks here in Ohio. So with that being said, I'm going to try to share my screen here. We'll make this work. Yeah. Okay. Are we good? Can we see it? Mm-hmm. Yay. All right, cool. We've crossed our first hurdle for today. The screen share works. Yay. Okay. Just by way of background, so Equality Ohio is the statewide organization that is committed to LGBTQ+ equality. So we are headquartered out of Columbus, but we also have offices in Cincinnati and Cleveland. I'm based out of Cleveland. So the organization itself has been around for about 16 years now. And we have had a legal clinic, which is where I serve in the organization for about 4 years. I guess I've been here for 5 years, so about 5 years now. And our legal clinic is responsible for providing direct service legal representation for low-income LGBTQ+ folks. So we are free legal services in 9 different areas of practice. I get to do them all because we're a small nonprofit. So 9 different areas of practice, and all of the folks who benefit from the legal representation are 300% or below of the federal poverty line and are self-identified as LGBTQ+. So in terms of where we're going today, before we kind of launch into it, so I encourage, if folks have questions along the way, please ask them. I want this to be a dialogue and conversation as much as possible. I've prepared for our hour together to talk for like maybe 20-25 minutes of time. I might go a little bit over, but then for the rest of the time, I wanted to make sure to leave ample space for folks who have questions or comments or other things that they want to share in the space. So in terms of where we're going today, we're briefly going to talk a little bit about LGBTQ+ cultural humility. And really that's with the goal of making sure that we are all using the same body of knowledge for terms and terminology. Next, we'll talk a little bit about medical legal partnerships, specifically in the context of why and how they work for serving members of the LGBTQ plus community. We will briefly go through, and I could do a whole hour just on this, but we will briefly go through a state of the state. What do legal protections for LGBTQ plus folks look like now? I made this PowerPoint yesterday, and we just had a significant change about 2 hours ago, and what legal protections might look like going forward in light of the Supreme Court decision in 303 Creative via Lennis. I have not had the opportunity to read through the entirety of the opinion at this point. However, we can talk a little bit about the potential impacts that might have on public accommodations protection and non-discrimination protections here in Ohio, with the caveat that I am not the right person to currently opine on the breadth of that opinion because I haven't had the chance to read the whole page, 70-page document at this point. And then finally, I'll tell you all just a little bit about some of the work that we do in our legal clinic, just to make you aware of services that we offer, in case that might be helpful to folks who are in your networks or communities. So starting off, just very briefly with terms and terminology. So one of the terms that you'll hear used frequently in like the sociology literature base, and sometimes in the, the research base for talking about the LGBTQ plus population is this acronym SOGI. And I really like SOGI. It's how we generally tend to frame our conversations, because it's encompassing of all members of the community. So SOGI, SO is sexual orientation, GI is gender identity, and E is gender expression. So just kind of going through these terms very, very quickly to make sure that we have a common understanding of what those terms mean. So sexual orientation is generally more familiar to folks sometimes than gender identity and gender expression might be. So sexual orientation, that is, who are you attracted to? Or some folks are asexual or aromantic and not attracted to people. That's all right too. So whether somebody is heterosexual, homosexual, pansexual, bisexual, all of that falls under that umbrella term of sexual orientation. This is different than gender identity. So it's possible that somebody can have a gender identity that is not cisgender, and also be straight, or someone can have a gender identity that is transgender and also be gay or pan or bisexual or anything else in the spectrum of sexual orientation. So in short, the terms and terminology that we like to use here when we're talking about gender identity is if somebody's sex assigned at birth is in alignment with their innate sense of what their gender is, then that person is cisgender. So when sex assigned at birth and gender identity match, that person's a cisgender person. Whereas when someone's gender identity is not in alignment with the sex that they were assigned at birth, that person would fall into the umbrella of being transgender. So many of us might feel more comfortable or more familiar with folks who are trans and still identify within a gender binary. So a trans woman, an individual who was assigned male at birth, but their gender identity is female, or a trans man, someone who was assigned female at birth, but their gender identity is male. However, there's also individuals who identify as non-binary, and non-binary is an umbrella term that is used for folks who are not cisgender and also do not fall into binary transgender categories as well. So sometimes you might hear clients or patients refer to themselves as NB. Usually it's spelled out ENBY. It's just it's NB, non-binary. But that's pretty common. And non-binary is, again, an umbrella term for lots and lots of different identities that fall within that umbrella of non-binary, if that makes sense. And then finally, gender expression. That is how an individual moves about the world. What are they showing us in terms of how they are expressing their gender? So I always make myself feel really awkward when I talk about this and I say, like, okay, everybody look at me. So I am a non-binary human. I identify as non-binary. However, my gender presentation, my gender expression is definitely more femme. I'm wearing some lip gloss today. I've got, long hair. I'm wearing a shirt that's, like considered a women's cut, right? However, that gender expression in no way negates my gender identity. So one thing I like to tell folks, and I think it's very, very important when working with this population of folks, is to understand that someone's gender expression might not always be a reflection of their gender identity. And that can be for a lot of reasons. Oftentimes, someone might not feel comfortable being out in all areas of their lives. Sometimes someone's gender expression, and if they were to, display themselves in social settings with a gender expression that match their gender identity, they might be at fear of their own personal safety or fear potential harassment. So I think the really important takeaway here is to never assume someone's gender identity as a result of what you perceive as their gender expression. Gender expression does not negate someone's queerness, does not negate someone's gender identity. And the other important thing to take away is that sexual orientation and gender identity are two different things. So they're all covered within this acronym of SOGI, but sexual orientation is separate and distinct from gender identity, and gender expression is separate and distinct from gender identity and sexual orientation. So for some of you, that might have been stuff that you all already know. And if so, that's wonderful. I'm glad that you do. But I just wanted to make sure that everybody has the same basis in language as we move through the rest of the presentation. Before I move on, any questions about any of that? Okay, great. So just kind of to wrap up before we launch into the meat of the presentation today, I love this little gender unicorn graphic. It's by the Trans Student Educational Resources Network. I love it. It's something that I will frequently show to clients or have available on a poster in the office. So I love it because it just kind of sets out all of these individual parts of this little unicorn, and shows where gender identity, gender presentation, sex assigned at birth, sexual and romantic attraction are all separate and distinct parts of this little unicorn. And I also just think it's adorable. I mean, it's a purple unicorn. All right. So now that we kind of have a common basis in language, next we're going to talk a little bit about medical legal partnerships and why they are absolutely crucial in serving vulnerable members of the LGBTQ+ community. So I like to bring this back to a discussion of social determinants of health, which I'm sure it's very familiar to all of you. I am not a social worker. I am not a medical professional. Occasionally, I have to play a social worker on TV. But one thing that I can say, and this is from my perspective as a legal practitioner, is that social determinants of health are so important in understanding the specific needs of the LGBTQ+ community. So I'll throw out just a quick example here. So let's think about a transgender woman, so a person who was assigned male at birth, who identifies as a woman. They are a transgender woman, and she is living, with her parents. She can't afford housing, outside of that circumstance. And she is trying to get medical coverage, insurance coverage for gender affirming care. But she is having a difficult time getting a pre-authorization from her insurance to cover that gender affirming care. She also is confused about how she can update her Ohio birth certificate or change her legal name, and she doesn't have the resources or the knowledge of the court system to be able to do those things. So very common situation that many of us have seen in practice, if for folks who are working as medical professionals or for folks who come into my legal clinic. So let's look at that situation in terms of how her specific gender identity and the fact that she is a trans woman might impact social determinants of health in her case. So we know that she is living with her family right now. She can't afford her own housing. We don't know if her family is affirming or not. We don't know if she's safe at home or not. We do know statistically that transgender women are at a much higher rate of risk of being victims of violence as compared to the general population as a whole. We don't know about her access to gender affirming care. We're having those insurance issues, right? So first off, we don't even know if she's going to have access to gender affirming providers. But we also know that she's currently dealing with issues of not being able to access gender affirming care that is likely very, very important to her mental health because of the limitations of her insurance. We also know that she's struggling with her name and gender marker correction. Well, that really can have an impact on economic stability. So in this case, say that she wants to go and apply for a job. She goes, she applies for the job. She does a wonderful job in the interview. You're hired. You're fantastic. We need you to prove your US citizenship. Well, without those documents corrected, she's just outed herself in the workplace. And she has no other option other than to do that, right? So she's opened herself up to additional potential for discrimination that could impact her economic stability simply as a result of not having those documents updated and not knowing or having the resources to do that. So I like to provide this example just because we all know that social determinants of health impacts health outcomes. It impacts healthcare expenditures, health status, limitations of those individuals, mortality, morbidity. We know that those things are all impacted by social determinants of health, but I think that it's incredibly important for us to recognize as we go through social determinants of health that those determinants can be very, very specifically impacted as a result of somebody's queer identity. So let's break it down a little bit more to the LGBTQ plus community in general. So this is my slide of sad things. Each one of these images shows an area in which there's a disproportionate comorbidity within the LGBTQ plus community. So we know that as opposed to the population in general, LGBTQ plus folks are far more likely to experience suicidal ideation. We also know statistically that LGBTQ plus folks are 3 times more likely than the general population to experience addiction, and also about 3 times more likely than the general population to experience a mental health issue that's been diagnosed. And that's not to say anything about folks who haven't been diagnosed, which I'm sure there's very, very many people, particularly out of our low income folks and our folks who are BIPOC identified and also members of the LGBTQ plus community. So we know that 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ plus, and this is again an understudied area. But we do know that based on data from the Trevor Project, the #1 reason why these homeless youth are on the street is as a result of familial rejection. So even though numbers have improved, the LGBTQ plus community is disproportionately at rate of risk for contracting HIV and living with HIV. We also know that individuals who are LGBTQ plus identified are far more likely to be prosecuted for engaging in survival crimes or also in status offenses for things like breaking curfew. So that means that LGBTQ plus folks, particularly trans folks, are far more likely to have criminal histories than the population at large. And that's not because they're committing crimes at higher rates of frequency, but because they're LGBTQ plus identified, and statistically, they are more likely to be arrested, more likely to be prosecuted. When you isolate that to Black trans women, that statistic shoots up even higher. We also know that domestic violence for LGBTQ plus folks is notoriously understudied and underreported. all domestic violence is underreported. Absolutely. But there has really been a lack of research specifically into domestic violence within the LGBTQ plus community. The research that we do have lends support to the idea that the couples in which there is actually a higher rate of risk of domestic violence is actually within bisexual couples. And that could be for a few reasons. Could be that more people identify as bi, could be of underreporting of domestic violence and other relationships as well. But it's very important for us to keep in mind that it's crucial for us to screen folks for domestic violence when we see them, to ask that, or do you feel safe at home question, particularly for LGBTQ plus folks, because there's a variety of reasons that folks might not feel safe at home. The last thing that I'll cover on this slide is incidents of bullying and harassment for LGBTQ plus youth. So the organization GLSEN did a pretty broad scale report. I believe this data is from 2019. I don't have my notes in front of me, but I believe that's correct. And they did a broad scale research project and survey of LGBTQ plus identified youth. What they found was that 73% of LGBT plus identified youth had missed at least one day of school because they had felt unsafe in school. And when you isolate that to transgender identified children, that number shoots up to 98% of trans youth who reported either physical harassment or bullying as a result of their gender identity within the past year. So that means that we're seeing disparate impacts in education as well. When kids don't feel safe at school, they're not able to engage in school in the same way that children who do feel safe in school are. So we're seeing disparate impacts there as well. So I talk about this because people don't self-identify legal problems. They might self-identify, and for those of you who work in the medical field, you're probably like, please don't self-identify your medical issue. But many folks do, might be more inclined to seek out medical assistance than legal assistance because they don't think about things in terms of being a legal problem, right? So this is not statistically isolated to LGBTQ plus folks, but the research does suggest that when legal services are used to address social needs of individuals, the health outcomes are significantly better for those people. People are more commonly take their medications as prescribed. People report less stress and experience improvements in mental health. People are more stably housed, their utilities are less likely to be shut off, and then individuals with chronic illnesses are healthier and are also admitted to the hospital less frequently. So when we're able to create partnership between medical service providers and legal service providers, oftentimes we're able to collaboratively address those social determinants of health. And especially when we are working with practitioners who are culturally humble and serving LGBTQ plus identified individuals, we're able to go a step beyond, and we're able to see how those social determinants of health might play out in really, really unique or different ways for LGBTQ plus identified folks as compared to the population at large. So when does a life problem become a legal problem? So I heard this phrase used a long time ago, and I'm just like, oh, I'm stealing that. Preventive lawyering, and I love it. Legal barriers can often hinder medical health. And that can be a result of mental health issues like PTSD, anxiety, depression can manifest as a result of legal barriers, and then also physical health. And this is an example that is frequently given by folks who talk about medical legal partnership, but I think it's a very apt example. So hypothetical patient keeps on going to the doctor because they're experiencing breathing issues. They're diagnosed with asthma, and the doctor continues to prescribe and prescribe and prescribe, and this asthma is still not under control. Eventually, after multiple appointments, it comes out that this individual is living in an old building and their apartment is covered in black mold. Obviously, that's going to have huge impacts on their health. But in that case, a life problem has indeed become a legal problem. Their health issue is something that could be remedied by an attorney, helping them potentially put their rent into escrow, or helping them, terminate their lease so that they don't have a legal penalty for finding a safer living environment. So that's why it's so important, because again, people don't self-identify their legal issues. It's why it's so important that individuals who are working with folks within the medical field and are having contact with patients as they come in are screening folks for issues like that. Because oftentimes, the medical practitioner might be trying to treat the condition, but the underlying reason that that condition is even occurring can be addressed through legal remedies. So let's put this in the specific context again of the LGBTQ plus community. So this is my little Venn diagram here. So we have the coalescence of these three things in the lived experiences of LGBTQ plus folks that we're trying to serve. We have medical health, mental health, and individual trauma coming into play. We have systemic inequalities coming into play. So that's the question of just not only can I access these services, but are these services affirming to me? Is this service provider going to misgender me? Is this service provider going to treat me differently because of my LGBTQ plus identity? And then we also have legal barriers on top of that. So sometimes we're in a situation where the law simply does not reflect the lived reality of LGBTQ plus individuals. Sometimes we're in a situation where an LGBTQ plus person might have to jump through additional legal loopholes because the law doesn't exist for them, as opposed to somebody who is a cisgender or heterosexual counterpart in the general population. We'll explore that a little bit more in the presentation as we go on. But really, these things are coalescing into the experience that an LGBTQ plus individual, particularly a person who's LGBTQ plus identified and also dealing with a comorbidity of being low income or in poverty, is experiencing when they walk through your door. So as we kind of jump into some of the more substantive parts of the presentation as well, I'm going to throw up a true or false to you all. I encourage you, go ahead and answer if you feel comfortable doing so. So here's our question, our true or false. After Obergefell, which was the Supreme Court's marriage equality decision, same-sex couples have the same parental rights as any other family here in Ohio. What do y'all think?
I'm guessing false because, I'm guessing false because I don't think you would have put it up there if it were true.
Yeah, I can't have happy things in this presentation, right?
No, you can. No, you totally can. It's just that, we make these assumptions all the time without really reading the documents because, law is not my profession. So,
Sure.
I may or may not be paying attention.
Absolutely. So yeah, for those of you who said false, that is correct. And one of the reasons why is because our family code, the Ohio Revised Code, and all the provisions dealing with family law have not been updated since, I believe, 2004. And the Obergefell decision happened in 2015. So what that means is that we still have gendered language in the Ohio Revised Code when it comes to establishing parental rights. So puts us in a situation. You've got two loving, devoted, beautiful moms who love their baby, right? They use an anonymous sperm donor. They comply with every bit of the Ohio law on assisted reproductive technology. They do everything right. They are married. And then, so birth mom gives birth to the child, and second mom is placed on the child's birth certificate. They're good to go, right? No. So Ohio law says there's a presumption of paternity. that that exists as the code is written right now. Whether that extends to non-bio mom in this situation is a separate issue. So I actually encourage, as best legal practice, for individuals who are non-biological parents to legally adopt their own child, just to ensure that that protection is in place. However, there's a circuit split here in Ohio on whether or not you can actually do that, because we have to do it as a step parent adoption. So here in Ohio, a second parent adoption, which is an option that exists in several other states, does not actually exist. So what we often have to do if we have a married couple in that situation, then we have to do the non-bio parent is a step parent of their own child. And we do it as a step parent adoption. However, if those folks aren't married, then that's not an option. And in that case, what we have to do is go back to a co-custodial agreement. So I give this example just to show you the legal barriers that can emerge for somebody who is LGBTQ plus identified, and the additional hurdles and loopholes and legal fallacies often that folks who are LGBTQ have to jump through in order to obtain the same legal protections that would apply to a cisgender heterosexual couple with by presumption in the law. And of course, this is even more of an issue for individuals who are low income. You know, how do you access those legal services? Adoptions are not inexpensive. How do you access those services or navigate those additional legal barriers if you are not an attorney? And also if you're an individual who's a lower income and simply can't afford to navigate those things. So what do we do about this? So what do we do about like our own practices? And then what do we do to screen folks to make sure that we're able to take care of some of these things preventatively, as opposed to, you know, we want to put these things out when they're a match instead of when they're a forced fire, right? So what I recommend doing, and I tell this to any professional I talk to, is to do an audit of whether or not you and your practice are creating safe spaces for LGBTQ plus people. So what does that mean? So I like to start out by saying, look at your intake forms. If you're working with individuals directly, is there a space for a chosen name? Do you ask about pronouns? Are you making assumptions? So sometimes even on court forms, I'll see husband's name, wife's name, right? Are we making assumptions about somebody's identity without meaning to? Because even in an instance where, you know, we might just be saying, we're just trying to collect the information, we might unintentionally be creating microaggressions in that space. So one common one that I think a lot of people don't even think about is home address. Home address. We know that LGBTQ plus people are at a disproportionate rate of risk for experiencing homelessness. We also know that familial rejection is a very, very pervasive problem within the community. So maybe there is no home address and the person gets to that spot on the form and they're like, I don't know how to fill this out. I'm going to walk out. Or maybe they do put down a home address, but there's no way for them to notate if that's a safe address. Maybe they're not out to their family or out to their partner yet. And they're just like, I don't know what name I should use because I don't want to be called my dead name. But if I put down my chosen name, it's possible that a receptionist calls my wife and asks for Jane instead of John, and then I'm outed. Right. So it's incredibly important for those of us who are engaged in direct services to do a holistic intake where we're taking these things into account, and then also to ensure that all staff that we work with has been trained on this stuff. So maybe there's a wonderful form, but the new person who's working in reception doesn't know that you can't use the chosen name for this person when you leave a message on the voicemail. Right? Well, that's going to be an issue. So it's very important to ensure that all of the folks that we work with are trained on this stuff. And the other thing that to keep in mind too is Whenever a client walks through my door, I know that they're low income. I know that they're LGBTQ plus identified. I also know that I am one in a whole series of systems that has probably failed them, because the systems were not necessarily made for the individuals who are trying to avail themselves of those services. Oh, I see a raised hand.
Hey, Kate, this is Kim Adams. I used to work with community legal aid, so I've worked with you before. But just in case people don't understand, could you explain what a dead name is?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. It's a great question. So a dead name is a term that's oftentimes used by transgender individuals for the name that they were assigned at birth that they no longer want to use or associate with. So different trans folks might have different feelings about that name. For some folks, it might feel like, you know what, that's a previous part of me. It still feels like it's part of my identity. I want a new legal name, but I also, don't want to feel completely divorced from that name. For other individuals, hearing that name might be traumatic. Or being referred to as that name might result in trauma. Those folks will sometimes refer to the name that they were assigned at birth as their dead name, and then their other name is their chosen name or their real name. The other term you should be aware of is dead naming someone. That is whether intentionally or inadvertently calling somebody that name that they do not prefer. The other term you should be aware of is misgendering, and that is referring to somebody by an incorrect pronoun. I will say we've all done it, me included, and I'm someone who works with this community every day. I have a very dear friend of mine. They use they, them pronouns. We'll say for the sake of this presentation, their name is Felix, okay? So Felix is like 6'3", and looks like a lumberjack and has a big bushy red beard. And the gender presentation in my view just feels so masculine that I've unintentionally misgendered them before, and I've used he, him pronouns, right? So when that happens, the way to deal with it is to catch yourself, correct yourself, apologize, move on. Felix, I am so sorry. I just used the wrong pronoun. They, them, move on, and then work to do better. So one thing that I encourage folks to do, especially when we have folks who are using like they, them pronouns, which might feel a little bit less comfortable for folks to use in the singular, even though we do it all the time without realizing it. We frequently use they, them pronouns in the singular, but it might, be a little bit of a practice to get into, to get more comfortable with doing that. So what I like to encourage folks to do is when you meet somebody, say their pronouns in your head like 3 or 4 times. When you say, okay, their name is John, they use they, them pronouns, John, they, them, John, they, them, John, they, them, and then move on. I find that helps a lot. But that being said, it's really kind of a habit to get into. And the vast majority of folks who are of the community are going to be so grateful that you're even making an attempt to use the correct pronouns. The bar is not that high, which is sad. It's sad, but true. But I think the most important thing is just if you do inadvertently misgender someone, correct yourself, move on, do better next time. So in terms of preventive lawyering, what are we screening for? So what should individuals who are coming into contact with folks who are coming into your office, what should we be asking? We should be screening to learn more about their environment, more about their family, about their safety, and access to justice. And the way that I like to think of this is, as opposed to a medical health checkup, it's a legal health checkup. So what I like to do, the specific things that I like to find out about, can they drive? Do they have access to transportation? Are there warrant blocks on their driver's license? That can happen fairly frequently. If somebody has an unpaid court cost, the court can put a warrant block on their driver's license. So until those court fines are paid, they're not legally allowed to obtain a driver's license or legally allowed to drive. Of course, that creates astronomical issues because it's a snowball effect, right? You can't drive, so you can't go get a job because you have to rely on the bus system. You don't live near a bus stop. You have to get to work to pay your court fines, but you can't get to work because you can't drive to get there, right? And it just kind of becomes a snowball for folks pretty frequently, but oftentimes those warrant blocks can be addressed very, very easily by an attorney to get that individual on a payment plan. I always like to screen for living wills and healthcare powers of attorney. Incredibly important for LGBTQ plus folks, oftentimes because chosen family is not necessarily going to be reflective of who is considered a legal family member within this community. So maybe I am not genetically related to this individual that I consider to essentially be my mom. And the biological mom that I do have is not affirming of me and, has not spoken to me in 15 years. It's incredibly important to screen folks, make sure that there is a living will and a healthcare power of attorney so that the decision makers in that person's healthcare decisions are the decision makers that they would want. It's also of particular importance for transgender individuals because they can provide directives for them to continue to receive gender affirming care. And they can provide those directives in those documents. Very, very important that folks have those in place. I like to screen for family law issues. Has parentage been established? Do you have kids? Do you have parentage established? I've been on one too many divorces representing non-bio parent and trying to argue that they should have parental rights to their own child. It's much better to get this stuff taken care of preventively. I also like to talk about credit checks. Do you know you can get those for free? Did you know that you can see what debt you owe and maybe we can get you on payment plans, get you in a better place for financial health? I also really like to screen for name changes and gender marker corrections. Is your legal name the name that you want to be called? Is the gender marker that displays on your identity documents the gender marker that reflects you? And I also like to screen for benefit eligibility. It is shocking to me how many folks who come through the clinic should be on Medicare or Medicaid and are not receiving those benefits, or qualify for things like SNAP and food stamps and are not receiving that assistance. So important to screen for that as well as you come into contact with folks in the community. There we go. Whoops. I think I went ahead one too many. Let me go back. There we go. All right, so before I move on to talk a little bit more about like specific issues here in Ohio, any questions on things that we should ideally be screening folks for, or some of that intersection of the medical stuff and the legal stuff? Okay, cool. So we're going to talk just a little bit about the state of the state. So this is Ohio. We have 88 counties. These counties are wildly diverse in how they handle some of these legal issues when related to the LGBTQ plus community. So again, I'll give you another true or false. After the landmark Supreme Court decision in Bostock, people cannot be legally discriminated against in Ohio. I don't think this is gonna, yeah.
That's gotta be
Kind of
false.
already covered it. Yeah, that's false. Here in Ohio, we do not have comprehensive statewide non-discrimination protection. The Ohio Fairness Act, which is a bill that would add these protections, was actually just introduced in the Senate this week, I believe. So it's been introduced before, it's never passed. It does have bipartisan support. But the Supreme Court decision in Bostock was a huge landmark decision in 2020, which said that sex-based discrimination in the employment context, so Title VII employment law, is inclusive of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. Huge decision. But that being said, LGBTQ plus Ohioans can still be fired or denied housing and public accommodations because of who they are, who they love, and a lot of other circumstances. So Bostock is a wonderful ruling, but it only applies to certain employers. And then the Bostock interpretation of sex-based discrimination has been applied in other areas of non-discrimination protection. Under the Biden administration, for example, they use that Bostock definition in the Fair Housing Act, which is great. But that being said, there are lots of individuals and landlords who are not bound by the Fair Housing Act. And then as of today, public accommodations protection just got thrown up into the air in the 303 created via Lennis decision. So we are going to see a broad impact as a result of that decision, in my opinion. So Ohio right now is one of 28 states that hasn't provided comprehensive non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ plus individuals. But today we received a ruling from the Supreme Court a couple hours ago that Colorado's non-discrimination provisions as applied were unconstitutional based on a free and compelled speech argument. So I do not think that it would be going real far to predict that several other states might have their non-discrimination laws challenged as a result of that decision. But here in Ohio, there is nothing to challenge yet because the non-discrimination protections don't exist. So I think it's helpful to think about our protections here in Ohio as a patchwork. So we've got employment protections, we have housing protections, and we have public accommodations. And because we don't have statewide protections, what we do have is this patchwork of municipalities who have enacted protections and then municipalities that have not. So where I am in Cuyahoga County, we have a comprehensive non-discrimination protection that was done on the county level. So we have those comprehensive protections. Let's take, for example, an individual who might be working in Cleveland, but they live in a 3-unit building, like a triplex somewhere in Lorain County. So in reality, they're going to lose some of their housing protections on their commute home somewhere on I-90. Because since it's a 3-unit building, it's not covered by the Fair Housing Act, has to be at least 4 units for that. So we have this patchwork where someone's geographic location in the state of Ohio can impact their level of legal protection from discrimination. And then we also have the issue of legal equality versus lived equality. So legal equality is the equal protection of LGBTQ plus people in policies and laws. So that's like our Ohio Revised Code using that gendered language for parentage, right? And then we have lived equality, which is the outcomes, the community well-being, and the lived experiences of LGBTQ plus people. So example I can give for this. So we have the Bostock decision, right? It happens in 2020, 6-3 decision, Gorsuch writing for the majority on that one. And it is a beautifully written decision. That one came down, I don't know, I think I'm jinxing it because I remember the Bostock decision came down like an hour before I was doing a Know Your Rights presentation. I was just like, dang it. And then 303 just happened today. Example I'll give. So Bostock decision happened. We now know that it is illegal in companies with more than 14 employees to discriminate on the basis of sex, and that sex-based discrimination includes both gender identity and sexual orientation. Great, we have that legal protection. Real case, a client of mine, 19-year-old trans man, so assigned female at birth, identifies as male. And he is working at a multinational fast food company in Columbiana County, Ohio. He goes to work every day. He's working tons of overtime, partially because he's trying to be a great employee so that he is trying to get through his 90-day probationary period so that he's able to get health insurance access, because that's crucial for his gender affirming care. And he's working as much overtime as he can because he's trying to save up for medical procedures that are not covered under his insurance plan. Again, gender affirming care procedures. So legally, we know that he's protected by Bostock, but when he goes to work every day, his manager is consistently dead naming him, misgendering him, and at one point even tries to feel his chest and says, I don't know if you're a girl or a boy. So physically tries touching him in the workplace. Bostock still exists, right? But Bostock's not being felt in the lived experience of this 19-year-old kid working at a fast food location in Columbiana County, Ohio. So sometimes there's a gap. Even if the legal protections do exist, they are not being felt in the lived experiences of everyday Ohioans, which is why, again, I go back to screening and how important it is to ensure that we are screening folks to address some of these situations and lead to better outcomes for lived equality. How can we translate legal equality into the lived experience of that individual? So other thing I wanted to cover very, very briefly in terms of stuff that's percolating around in the state house that I think is probably of unique interest to folks who are here today is House Bill 68. It's also called the SAFE Act. It's really the Unsafe Act. It is a proposed ban on providing gender affirming care to any individual who is under the age of 18, and that includes consultations and gender affirming mental health services. It also would prohibit physicians from referring patients under 18 to out-of-state affirming care providers. It bans banning conversion therapy. And then it also would create a database which would track anonymized data relating to youth experiencing gender dysphoria. We know that that's a small population, particularly in rural counties. So that provision could be, in effect, a forced outing for individuals who are outside of urban centers as well. So as of right now, the SAFE Act has passed the House floor. It is not law. It has passed the House floor. That means it's going to the Senate. So this is one that's very, very important. And there are several anti-LGBTQ plus bills that are floating around our legislature right now, but this is one that would have horrific effects on our youth, absolutely horrific effects on our youth. And also could result in forcible detransitioning for youth who have been granted access to gender affirming care as well. So this is certainly one to keep an eye on. So what should you do? So what I always like to tell professionals in spaces like this, whether you are an attorney or a medical professional or an individual who's working in research, assuming that you have that graduate level education, the individuals that you went to law school or med school or that you got your your LISW with, oftentimes are the individuals who are in these committees. So it's important for us to be vocal to committee chairs, committee members, party leadership, our own representatives, and then also leaders in the executive branch as well. It's incredibly important that we as professionals are vocal. So I'll sum up really quickly before turning this over to questions. I want to be mindful of the time. And I'm just going to talk to you very, very briefly about some of the services that we offer in our legal clinic, just so you're aware of those resources. So all of the legal services that we provide for folks are free. Our clients are responsible for paying filing fees. Oftentimes those can be put on payment plans depending on which court you're in or what your proceeding is. And there's also a community aid pot for paying filing fees for legal name changes and gender marker corrections here in Ohio. And that's administered through Trans Ohio, which is a wonderful organization. So in terms of what we do at the legal clinic, so what we did is we looked at areas disproportionately impacting folks in poverty and areas disproportionately impacting LGBTQ plus folks. We Venn diagrammed them, and the stuff that was in the middle is what became our practice areas. So we do a lot of criminal justice support and advocacy. That includes things like getting civil protection orders for folks, or even for folks who might be, queer identified and are fearful of interacting with law enforcement. Sometimes that means that we do the quasi-legal thing of sitting down with somebody in a police interview. If they want to make a police report, going with them to do that and really serving in that more advocacy role. We also will help with victim compensation applications, and then we'll also provide representations for victims in criminal cases as well. We do the gambit of family law, all the family law. I get a lot of family law in the Cleveland office, and actually family law within legal aid organizations, family law is actually the most demanded practice area because it's a lot of times where folks have legal issues. We do some consumer law work. The most important of those is probably debt negotiations, helping folks get on payment plans. We do a lot of benefit support work. That's everything from disability applications, food stamps, Social Security issues, Social Security overpayments when the government wants money back. We deal with those as well. And then we do a lot of health insurance work as well for individuals who are denied access to gender affirming care under the provisions of their healthcare policy. We do discrimination cases. We do expungements and criminal record sealings. And then we also do a ton of legal name changes and gender marker corrections here in Ohio. Gender marker corrections are a little bit up in the air right now on Ohio birth certificates. That being said, on other pieces of identity documents, like an Ohio driver's license, or a US passport, we're not seeing those same issues. Right now, it kind of depends on where you are in Ohio. We are pending the decision in an Ohio Supreme Court case on gender marker corrections on Ohio birth certificates. But in the meantime, we have 28 counties that are denying them, and we have other counties that are granting them. So it's a little bit location dependent right now. That being said, if you've got folks who are in need of those services, please send them over, and we can see if they have a viable filing option. So the way to get in touch with us, somehow nobody took 855 LGBT law, so we took it. And then also we have an online intake that's available as well for a client to complete online, and they just submit the form, and then someone from our intake team reaches out to them to schedule an appointment to do a full intake. So we wanted to make sure that we were accessible to folks who are comfortable using the internet and less comfortable. So both that phone line and the website, both exist for the purposes of doing intake. So I definitely talked too long, but that being said, I'm happy to stay around if anybody has any additional questions or anything else that they wanted to put into the space.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I'd like to acknowledge a mistake that I made when I was reading your bio. After the second sentence, I used the pronoun she. So I'm so glad that you elevated what to do when you do make a mistake. So thank you for that. And we do have a message in the chat. Can we get a copy of this presentation in the chat for our future reference and education? Very relevant for my roles in clinical research at Cleveland Clinic and my school board position in Lorain County. And then we have a question from KM Adams.
As far as you talking about the social determinants of health, which is extremely important, do you all have, and this I think piggybacks from the request in the chat, something that can really help? Because I did legal clinics for our veterans at Legal Aid, and I went out to the VA, and one of the things that we did was we provided something that was laminated that kind of connected the social determinants of health with what you all do as far as legal issues. Mm-hmm. Is there anything that you have available for that to provide for researchers, folks in the clinical setting, so they know to make that association? Because you don't always make it. When you're talking to a patient for 30 minutes, you don't really have the time to make that association. So something that can jog their memory, if they see that issue, because as you said, I mean, your patients or your individuals that are coming in as research participants may have issues with housing. Mm-hmm. And that may be the reason why they're having, maybe their kid is missing school because they're having asthma, problems. So something that can jog their memories to say, maybe we need to screen for this so we can get them to the appropriate resources.
Yeah, so I actually generally really like doing it on intake forms. I don't, I wish, now I'm just like, I should create that resource. So I don't think I have something right now, but get back to me in a couple of weeks and I probably will. But I really love including those questions at intake. So the ones that I usually recommend asking are, if you if you see that some individual is, filled out pronouns, and if you see that they've written that their chosen name on their form is different than their legal name, well, then that prompts me to ask, do you want help with, or are you looking to change your legal name, right? I always like asking, like, do you feel safe at home? Are you able to afford, your basic living necessities? Things like that. So I don't have a great resource off the top of my head that's already been created for that.
I can recommend one for you, who to contact.
Yeah, that would be great.
Contact Marie Curry at Community Legal Aid. We use
Contact Marie. Okay.
Yeah, we use one with maternal health and
Sure.
health. And it may work, and then you may be able to incorporate your questions in that too, and then that may be able to go out.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, because I know like for our screenings for like folks who are doing intakes for the legal clinic, but I think, I think best practice is always asking those questions at intake, but I'll definitely, I'll take a look at that, and I'll get back to you. I'll follow up with you on that one, because I think it's a great question. Okay, great.
With 1 minute to spare, do we have any more questions? It looks like, okay, we do. I'm interested in benchmarking the Ohio LGBTQ+ law in the bid to fight for fairness and non-discrimination policies here in Uganda.
I used to work in Uganda. I worked at a refugee law project in Kampala, working with sexual and gender minorities. I know that fight very well. Yes, I would be happy to share the presentation. Jaleese, what I'll do is I'll just email you a PDF copy of the slides if that works.
That would be perfect. Thank you so much, Kate. Well, we appreciate your time and expertise, and would love to have you back as more things unfold. But in the interim, very quickly, let's talk a little bit about what's next. So in September 29th from 12 to 1, also via Zoom, we will be talking about race and ethnicity, the Hispanic and Latina community. And we'll have the director for the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities, Dr. Elizio J. Perez-Stable. And what can you do today? You can schedule a READI consultation at spark.case.edu, sign up to attend future programming, and join our listserv so that you don't miss out. And you can review our CTSC DEIA resources. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great weekend.
Thank you all so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.